to Ask the Expert. I'm delighted to offer a warm welcome to our panel of experts, Brahm Norwich, Christopher Robertson and Jean Ware, and to thank them for joining us this morning. Through their teaching and research, the members of our panel have contributed nationally and internationally to our understanding of and improvement in the education of children and young people with additional and complex learning needs. So I'm just going to introduce them briefly, one at a time. Brahm Norwich is Professor of Educational Psychology and Special Educational Needs at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Exeter. He was previously Professor of Special Needs Education at the Institute of Education, London University. And he's worked as a school teacher, a professional educational psychologist, and university teacher and researcher. Christopher Robertson recently retired from being a lecturer in inclusive and special education at the University of Birmingham. He's had extensive experience teaching children and young people with physical and or severe learning difficulties and profound and multiple learning difficulties. His teaching and research interests are in the areas of educational policy, international perspectives on special and inclusive education, the coordination of provision for children and young people with SEN, pupil and student participation, and all aspects of teacher education. Jean Ware is recently retired from Bangor University as a reader in special education. Previously, she worked as a teacher, mainly with pupils with severe and profound and multiple learning difficulties, and as a university teacher and researcher at the Institute of Education and at Cardiff University. Before moving to Bangor, she was Director of Special Education at St Patrick's College in Dublin. And Jean's research focuses mainly on improving the education of pupils with PMLD, particularly through developing effective continuing professional development. So that's about our panel today. So to our audience out there, just to let you know how this is going to work, we've put together some questions designed to lead to interesting and worthwhile debate for you to engage with this morning. You're all invited to contribute to this discussion by typing further questions or comments into the chat. The panel will start by offering answers from their experience, and at the end of each either set of questions or individual questions for discussion, we'll look back at the chat to include your contributions and to develop the debate further. To our audience out there, your experiences and questions are a really valuable part of this session, so please do take the opportunity to engage with the panel. Any references to reading or research that the panel make will be made available later to you on PebblePad. Okay, so the first discussion that the panel would like to start relates to excellence in practice, and Jean is going to start this discussion, and the opening question is, can you share examples of excellent practice and why did you think that it was excellent?
We've agreed between us as a panel that we're going to start by each offering one example, because we've just said before you joined us, we could spend happily between all of us, spend all morning talking about examples of excellence in practice, and that wouldn't really get the discussion to where it wants to be, I think. So the example I want to offer is an example from Wales, and it's an example with learners with profound and multiple learning disabilities. In the particular school I'm thinking of, which was actually had both a PMLD and an MLD unit in a mainstream primary school. In the unit, each learner had their own programme with targets which they were working on. Meticulous records were kept of all the learners achieved, but above all, they found learning fun and motivating, and that was clear from watching them. And just to give you one example, one young learner was working on anticipation, learning to anticipate things that were expected. And he very clearly revelled in the game that was used to teach him this skill. The teacher was looking for him to anticipate her pretending to drop him while she held him on her knee and she counted down and so on. And you could see him really enjoying the experience of her pretending that she was about to drop it. And of course, always catching him in time. But he was so motivated. He absolutely loved the experience. So that's my example. Brahm?
Right. Good morning. My example is of sort of collaboration between teachers and teaching assistants to better understand the needs of a particular girl who was having difficulty in writing down simple arithmetic additions in the sort of early primary school years. And it's an example of lesson study. And this is an example that involved class teacher, special needs coordinator, and the teaching assistant in the class. And they focused on this particular girl because they couldn't quite understand why she was having this difficulty. This is in an ordinary classroom situation. And I mean, basically, without going into great length about it, I mean, lesson study is a form of sort of pedagogic action research, I guess is the best way, in which you try and understand a pedagogic question, answer a pedagogic question of what is going on that a particular child or group of children aren't learning, whatever the goal of the learning is. And it is a sort of slowing down of a process of review, seeking additional knowledge that might inform the practice, then implementing it, then reviewing again. So it's a very close type of formative assessment. And I think the particular example I have in mind, I think is a very good example because the team consulted a mathematics specialist who actually showed that they had a misconception about the child's needs and the kind of support that this child might need. And on the basis of seeking that sort of additional knowledge, which they then implemented in the cycle, I see this as an example. Why? I mean, that's the really important question. Why is it an example of good practice? I think it's an example of good practice because it slows down the teaching learning process where you need to do so. I mean, you can't, it's a very intensive process, an expensive process, but I do see it as a very important process for which schools ought to make the time for teachers to do. And one of my experiences of working with teachers who have undertaken these type of lesson studies is that the kind of comments you pick up are, gosh, this is the sort of thing I went into teaching to do. So I think that would be my example, partly because I guess it's the sort of very systematic, practically focused, formative reflection in a collaborative context. That's my example of good practice.
Me next, Liz. Yep, Christopher here. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different perspective, I think. I'm assuming all colleagues today work in the Welsh context. And if that's the case, then you will be well aware of the Additional Learning Needs Code of Practice. And Section 816 in the Additional Learning Needs Code of Practice talks about the ALNCO and schools or settings promoting a pupil or student's inclusion in the school or FEI community, and that relates to the curriculum, access to extracurricular activities, etc. The example that relates to that, for me, is as follows. I recently moved to a village stroke town in the Cotswolds here in England, and well, half moved there. And there's a very large comprehensive secondary school, the village town, that serves a large geographical area. And it makes provision for a full range of children and young people, almost, and has some what are called learning support provision across the 11 to 18 age range. Well, to cut a long story short, the school communicates with the community. The community village town publishes a newsletter every month about what's going on in the village. Every month, the village comprehensive and the primary school publish an update on what's going on in the school, telling you this, that, and the other, successes, what's interesting, etc. Well, in March, I just came across what I thought was a really nice example of how a school's ethos can be genuinely inclusive at a leadership level. There was a little article, and it was about what successes there had been in the school in the last 3 months or so. And very evident was that the school was very proud that 3 of its sixth formers had made it into Oxford or Cambridge University. So that was a big biggie for them. You know, parents would be pleased, so on and so forth. But the interesting bit of the article, it's only about 500 words long, was this. That bit of information was in the last paragraph of the newsletter article. First paragraph of the newsletter article focused on the success of students in the learning support provision who were successful in their work placements, one in an equine centre and other students in a centre where they were developing their catering skills. And it just struck me that that was a really positive way in which the school leadership was communicating an inclusive ethos to people at large. And it wasn't fronting the article with the Oxford successes. They mattered, but so too, and in this instance, maybe more so, the headlines were around the students in the learning support provision. So that was my example.
So we thought we'd each say what we think we can draw out of these examples. And I don't know if you want to read that question out, Fliss, or not.
Following on from that, and it comes from this very rich context that you've been able to describe between you. You know, what does excellence in practice then look like? I guess that's the drawing of things together, as well as how can you measure that and communicate it to others. I think Christopher's example gave us an idea around the communication as well. So maybe those are the areas to look at next, about drawing those things together. What does excellence in practice look like on a wider scale? What is it that we're looking for?
One thing that stands out for me about obviously the example I chose, but also about the example Brahm has chosen, is that they focus on very careful assessment. One of the things about the unit, which I briefly described, is that there were meticulous records. One of the things that made the teaching of those young people really excellent was the fact that, although I have to say the unit had some of the most disabled young people I've met in quite a long life in working with people with profound and multiple learning disabilities, everybody had been carefully assessed and were working at their level. And motivation, the things that motivated them, were also assessed, both at a group and an individual level. And another thing which I think is particularly important, the teachers were committed to making learning a fulfilling experience for all learners, and had the opportunity to do that in that school. I'm sure there are other things that stand out. I think collaboration, particularly for students with ALN, is very important. And Brahm's lesson study example for me draws that out as well. On measuring excellence and communicating it, I'm not very keen on the idea of measuring excellence, if I'm honest. I can't see it comes in so many different forms. I don't think a measuring rod of any sort, a metaphorical measuring rod, could actually communicate it. But if we're going to talk about how can you spot it, it would be that learners are engaged and motivated. They've had a hand in what they're learning and how they're learning it in some shape or form. And the thing Chris mentioned, the achievements of every learner are genuinely celebrated, and the teachers are constantly engaged in assessing the outcome of their teaching and seeking to improve it. So that's my contribution on that.
Thanks, Jean. Should we, Brahm, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I really like Jean's summary, actually. I go along with all of that. I definitely go along with all that. I want to sort of maybe build on her reservations about the term excellence. And I think part of that is the way excellence is used by policymakers. And we have an example of that currently in England with the new Special Needs and Disability Improvement Plan, where they talk about more inclusive provision, more inclusive and excellent provision. And the problem with excellence, the problem with all these terms, including inclusion, if I might say, I'm not excluding inclusion from this, is that the words are sort of used in a very glossed over way, and they ignore a point Jean was making, that there are many elements to it, so many dimensions to this. You know, are you talking about excellence in attainment? Are you talking about excellence in provision? Are you talking about, you know, and I mean, some of the things that Jean was talking about, like the emotional and relationship side of teaching and learning, do you talk about excellence in that way? I don't think we do. I prefer a term like quality, and then you can qualify quality. And I think the risk is that these words assume a significance which numbs the mind, I guess is the way I would see it, from actually thinking carefully about what it is. And in the end, I mean, if you're going to talk about excellence, you've really got to say, well, what are your purposes? What's the point of education? What's the point of school education? What are schools for? And I thought Jean was summarizing that very well. So that's my sort of addition to what Jean said. I won't say more than that.
Thanks, Brahm. No, that's really interesting. And the language that we use around in education is, they say, we can become quite, if it's overused, it becomes quite a cliche, doesn't it? Perhaps we forget what we're actually meaning by that terminology. Christopher, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, but I'll be very brief, because I think we're almost close to moving into the next question, actually. But I'll say something very, very briefly, concurring with comments made. It's very much the case, isn't it, that terms like excellence are kind of policy shorthand for a whole bundle of things that unravel in practice very, very frequently. I just wanted to kind of reference back to the example I gave and just refer us to the term equity and highlight its importance in the way in which we plan and support a wide range of children and young people. And the principle of equity, to my mind, does enable us to recognise that individuals and groups of children all matter. But actually there are practicalities at school levels in terms of what can be achieved, in what ways, in what context. So I wanted to flag up the importance on occasions, not always, of parallel and valued learning pathways under one organizational umbrella, if you like. And that, I think, is very important. I just wanted to, it's not another example, but just reference colleagues to the recently published Royal National Institute for the Blind resource. It published a curriculum framework that relates to learners with visual impairments. And it, to my mind, and by the way, it's available in Welsh as well as English, it's a very good example, I think, of looking at issues to do with equity with regard to a particular group of learners. And it sets out a very clear framework about that which may be additionally and differently important for individuals and other groups of learners. So I wanted to flag up at the value of a resource like that and argue that if it matters to a group of students with a visual impairment, then it can matter to a wide range of other students as well. The challenge has to do with the practicality of, you know, what can we achieve in the working day and what decisions, pedagogic decisions, do we need to make around what's most important for the child or young person to be learning at any given. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And yeah, those challenges, as you say, you know, what can actually be achieved during the working day is that is the root of the practicality, isn't it? We've, you know, with the staff that we work with the resources that we've got in the environments in which we teach, especially with groups of children and young people who, you know, every day is different for them. So they'd have some days when they're, you know, in a good place to learn, and other days when they're not in such a great place to learn, and all those things to take into consideration. But I think what Chris has done there is opened up the final question around excellence in practice, which is around the benefits and challenges of ensuring a whole setting consistent excellence in practice. So if we can perhaps kind of just finish this discussion on excellence in practice around this benefits and challenges, as my screen goes off and I lose the question, around consistency in excellence in practice in a whole setting. Jean, do you want to start us off again?
Yeah, I wanted to focus on the challenge to staff, and everybody will be aware of the current situation in England about Ofsted. And one of the things I think it's very easy to do is to inadvertently increase the stress that staff experience by trying to achieve whole school excellence in practice. I'll quote you an example, not of staff stressing increasing, but a school for young people with PMLD has kept records for many years of the progress of its pupils through the route map, which you can find on the, if you don't know it already, you can find on the Hub curriculum website. And in this school, one of the things that emerged was that pupils were getting stuck at a particular point. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of reasons why pupils get stuck. And I'll say now, what turned out to be the case was when the school was able to purchase some eye gaze equipment, that point of pupils getting stuck vanished. In other words, it was a new technology enabled the school to overcome the problem. But where pupils are moving through the school, perhaps mainly chronologically, obviously, if pupils get stuck in a particular class, that may raise questions for the school as a whole and for the teacher as an individual about whether they're as competent as the other staff. And if we're going to keep records which show how pupils progress in different classes, we need to be very careful about not immediately attributing blame to the person who happens to be teaching that class. And therefore, that's a challenge I particularly wanted to build on. Obviously, the benefit comes from the same example, that excellent record keeping, which was discussed in the whole school, meant that they spotted that there was something that was particularly difficult to teach to part of their group of learners, and were able to do something about it and overcome the problem. I'm sure I've said enough at that point.
Thanks, Jean. Brahm, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the issue of challenge is considerable. I mean, Jean has talked about the situation in England and Ofsted, and there's been renewed focus, as people probably know from the media, on Ofsted and the way Ofsted reports. And to me, I think the big issue is, it's a sort of policy issue, really, about what are the expectations on schools and the extent to which the professionalism of teachers is taken account of in the way school reform or school changes identified and followed through. And I see the current special needs green paper and improvement plan as a very good example of how not to do it. And that's a major challenge. The green paper and the improvement plan makes all sorts of comments about how the school inspection system is to take account of special educational needs. But I think that's just words, as far as I'm concerned. That's just rhetoric. How this gets translated into practice seems to me to be a considerable challenge. And I think part of the issue is, and I think you're in a much better situation in Wales, from what little I know about Wales, is that we've got this sort of fragmented school system with a local authority. The local authorities having a responsibility for special educational needs through the sort of EHCP system. But actually the governance of school is now very much influenced by the multi-academy trust system. So I think those are very serious challenges. And I mean, of course, COVID has also been a challenge in terms of supporting children and young people. So I mean, it's sort of endless, it's very complicated, and I think it's quite a crisis. And I'll just tell you my local experience. Devon, where the authority that I live in, did very badly in its special needs inspection. And I remember talking to one of the psychologists who I knew from our training course, and I said, well, what did you think about this? Do you think this is, was that a fair statement? The psychologist said, yes, it was a very fair, things are really not working very well. Well, about a month ago, there were parents protesting at outside County Hall about the quality of provision. And this week they were up at the House of Commons protesting. I mean, that gives you a sense of what is going on. The number of children with educational healthcare plans has doubled in the last, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years. So clearly there are considerable challenges. I mean, that's what I can say. I think that's all I can say.
No, thanks, Brahm. It's really interesting to hear that different context, and to give a kind of comparison with what's happening in Wales at the moment as well. Christopher, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, let me bring it straight back to Wales if I can. Colleagues will know probably that in the last year in Wales, there's been a 20% reduction in the number of children and young people identified as having an additional learning need. And we know, in theory, the definition of ALN is the same as the definition of SEN. When the so the number's gone down from 92,668 to 74,661 in a year. That's a big drop. One possible explanation that the Minister for Education in Wales is giving for this is that this evidences the benefits of a new and more inclusive curriculum. Now, I have absolutely no idea whether that's the case or it's not the case. So there could be a benefit in terms of a new curriculum, but there are other explanatory factors that might come into play. But I think the challenge here for colleagues working in school and FEI contexts is, well, what about that group of learners who no longer have a special educational need or an additional learning need? And actually, if you look at the data in Wales around children who used to have a statement or may still have a statement, or a smaller group of youngsters with a higher level of need, the numbers around that group of children and young people has not changed significantly. This other group of youngsters, loosely termed students with a general learning difficulty, who have either disappeared or having the needs met better. So I just kind of share that with colleagues in the room, as it were, to consider in terms of how it feels from where they might be working.
Thank you. No, that's really great to have those questions asked, especially, we've got the colleagues here with a huge range of different experiences as well. So shall we look to the chat now and see if we got Rhiannon, you're going to have a look at the chat and see if anybody's asking any additional questions. Don't be shy, this is your chance.
I think Caris has responded to Christopher's final comment. Caris, I don't know if you want to come in here. You've said it's to do with the definition.
Yes, I'd be interested to know. Oh.
Yeah, Caris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just trying to.
Thank you. Takes a time, doesn't it?
Just get my voice.
Video.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky, isn't it? Because we've got to be very careful with what the new, the ALN code says as what constitutes having additional learning needs now. And, the school action plus children may not need, additional learning provision, especially where many schools are making their universal provision so good now to cater for all their needs. But yeah, we've noticed a big drop just on sort of doing half the school, the mandated year groups. So our numbers of ALN on the register have dropped. But yes, it is a massive concern. We had Estin just last week, and we had that conversation, like, how are we going to make sure that we're making that provision for those children that we're really just monitoring now, and how are they not going to get lost in the system? Yeah, it is a concern. Yeah.
Thanks, Keris. And I can see Bethan Jones nodding away. Bethan, do you want to, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
I forgot that my video was on there for a minute. I was nodding at somebody outside, actually. No, I think I agree with Keris. It is a concern because I think, you know, the new system has sort of changed. Sort of, you don't have those children essay pluses. So, you know, I'm hoping that the figures sort of stay the same. I think as schools are becoming a little bit more aware of additional learning needs, the IDPs are a lot more fluid. It's a lot of work for schools as well to create these IDPs. So I think, you know, we're a lot more mindful of, you know, do these children need an IDP, which I would say, you know, is the same as a statement, but more fluid. So I'm hoping those figures sound absolutely fantastic. But, you know, I think it is a concern. I agree with Keris, because is it reflective of the schools being able to provide that universal provision that caters for all children with ALN, or is it just that, you know, we've taken children off our register and not replaced the statements with IDPs? So, you know, it's that raising awareness, and I think there is more awareness out there, but I think we need to, you know, I think we will have to wait and see with the Act to see whether it's actually true reflective of the ALN that's in our schools. It's lovely to see statistics like that, and actually that did bring a little smile to my face, but you know, it's just getting into the crux of, yeah, but the statements needed to change. The IDPs are fantastic. They're more fluid, they're opening conversations with parents and pupils and specialist agencies, which maybe we didn't have as much before with statements. So once a child had a statement, that was it, you know, so the IDP is a lot more fluid. And yeah, so it's an exciting time with the curriculum for Wales as well. It's just opening conversations, understanding ALN, and getting whole school approaches on board, especially with head teachers, I think.
Vicky's just put in the chat. Sorry, Vicky's just put in the chat. Yes, you know, the pupils will still be supported by support plans, but in that decision-making process that you've had a support sequence and then you're deciding on ALN, they do get that formal letter, don't they? That, you know, the decision is made that they do not meet that criteria of having ALN. So although we are still supporting them in that way, you know, I wonder what parents sort of think of that letter, that it's sort of like an official one, isn't it? Sort of like the decision is made, your child does not have ALN, you know, so it's, yeah, we've got to consider their thoughts as well.
Thank you, Keris. I wonder, Vicky, I don't know if you want to add to your comments.
Yeah, I think it's with this parental power, it's bringing parents along in the journey, and it has, like Bethan said, opened up that conversation around what the support they are getting in school. And maybe, like we said with statements, you weren't actually actively discussing that, but with this IDP person-centred process, the hope is, like Keris said, the parents get this formal, your child hasn't got ALN that requires an IDP, that could be that starting point for those person-centred meetings where you're saying, but look at everything else that they're getting that supports them. So, and it's bringing, you know, all stakeholders along in that journey to show what that inclusive practice looks like in the school, and raise it. And I feel it really has raised the profile of everything that the schools are doing to, you know, to support learners, that whole school inclusive practice. And it's having those opportunities, but it is bringing all stakeholders along so that they're not feeling like by moving from one system to the other they're missing out. It's actually making the system work for them.
Thank you, Vicky. Phyllis, are we moving on with the questions?
Yes, let's move on, but thanks everybody for the contributions there. And I think it just raises, doesn't it, at this time when there's a lot of new changes, both in policy and in practice, the importance of being able to talk about it. And I think having a forum like this where it can be discussed is really It's really useful. Right. So the next question is going to be answered. The lead is going to be Brahm on this one, and we're looking at a statement from Lani Florian, which was one of the pieces of reading that students have been offered as part of the introduction to this module. And the statement is, supporting class teachers to extend what is generally available to everybody, rather than including all students by differentiating for some, is an important shift in thinking that can avoid the negative effects of treating some students as different. So with that in mind, and the new code of practice in mind, and the way that people are working and the things we've been talking about today, how do we encourage that move from differentiation to inclusion?
That's for me to say something.
It is.
Yeah, well, this has been a long sort of issue, and I've recently been analysing some of Lani Florian's sort of ideas and examples that she gives. I think the problem, with that is that I would see that as a sort of blanket view, that what she puts forward is a blanket view that is not sensitive to whether difference is stigmatizing or marginalizing, or whether difference is actually welcomed. And to me, the important thing is what I guess you would call voice or agency, that some people want something different. Other people might not want something different. And I don't think one should have a blanket response to that. So I think it is false. And I think it's false in a very negative way, if I might say. I really disagree with Lani Florian, actually, in that there isn't the sensitivity to whether difference is a positive or negative. And I don't think you can decide that in advance and say that all difference is. And this is what someone at the Institute of Education a few years ago called universal inclusion. It's this idea that any differentiation, any separation, any labeling, whatever it is, special needs, disability, neurodiversity, is a negative thing. So I question that. Now, I'm not saying it can't be, and because it clearly can be, but I think it needs to be examined in the specific case, and it needs to take account of all the people involved in that situation. So I give you an example. Several years ago, I did a number of case studies of a range of children, and one of my cases was a 13-year-old boy with a visual impairment in a secondary school, very big secondary school. And the school made an enormous amount of accommodations, and parents are very satisfied, and he was satisfied. And he had an advisory teacher who knew him when he was a little boy, who'd come and visit him. And this young man said to the advisory teacher, "You're never to come into my class, because if you come into my class, they will know you're coming because of my visual impairment, and I don't want that to take place." So he saw that as stigmatizing, and he didn't want it. He was given the opportunity not to have it. But he definitely wanted to see this man, and this man gave him an enormous amount of support. So he managed how the differentiation was done. So I'm against, in principle, the idea that we talk about no longer differentiating, now we're including. That's just not how life is, as I see things. So I think that's an example of that. And I give you many examples of some children don't mind labels. They're proud of labels. They use labels because there's some agency in it. So that would be my response to Lani Florian. And I could give you, I mean, I can't do it now, but I could give you many examples of cases where she analyzes primary, and most of her work is primary, and there are really issues in the analysis. I see it as too purist a view, a sort of critically purist view, and not recognizing that difference is sometimes embraced positively by people. I guess if difference is imposed on people in undignified ways, that's unacceptable, and it's a difficult judgment.
Thank you, Brahm. And this is exactly why we wanted you here. Because the critical analysis of things that we are reading is so important. And for our colleagues here today, we talk to them about not just accepting what you read, but having that sort of critical analysis of it. So that's really, really welcome. Jean, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, I mean, Brahm said a lot of things. I think he's said them well, very well. What's one of the problems with, or some of the problems with this view, and I think it really is a knotty issue. I mean, and it seems to me that Brahm's brought up this very important point about difference doesn't have to be negative. And perhaps one of the things we ought to be learning and teaching our learners is to celebrate the diversity of humankind, that everybody is unique and of equal value. So, and that comes back to Chris's point about equity. And I think it also comes back to another point that Chris made in response to the first group of questions. The issue of there are some things that are necessary for pupils with particular additional learning needs. And while visual impairment is the most obvious one and the easiest, I think, often to illustrate, do we call what they have what they need? So, for example, audio description or Braille, as differentiation, or is it a support device, not differentiation? And I don't want to get hung up in that argument, because the words that we use aren't necessarily important. But I think it's also important that we pay attention to learners and their parents, as Brahm has said. And I'm going to give 3 very, very brief examples. Some parents, especially of learners with complex needs, such particularly severe ASD is the most obvious one, believe that inclusion is not the right solution for their child. And we need not to dismiss out of hand the idea that they might be right. I think we're too quick not to see that other people might be right and we might be mistaken in this instance. And the other main example I wanted just to give is of a boy I worked with many years ago. He had a fantastic teacher, and every time I suggested something in the course I was running, she'd put up her hand and say it would work for this particular little boy. And she was fantastic, and she carried on arguing till I travelled out to see, in her rural location in Ireland, the problem with this little boy. And we had the opportunity to communicate with his siblings and his parents and learn a little bit about him. He had very profound learning disabilities, but there is no doubt whatever that he reacted differently when there wasn't noise around him. So he needed a quiet environment that the other learners in the class at the time couldn't provide him with. But when he had a quiet environment, he did things that nobody in the school had seen him do before. Mm-hmm. And that was very salutary. To me, that was very salutary. The problem was the class he was in, if you like. It wasn't about the teacher. She was very committed and hardworking. it was about this issue of needing a quiet environment in order at his very, very early stage of learning to be able to learn and respond to things. So, and I was just going to agree with Brahm's example. There was another example of a learner with a visual impairment who'd gone all the way through secondary school to GCSE, done that. Secondary school had been fantastic. And then when it came to A-levels, he asked to go to a specialist college. He had a visual impairment that meant he could see much less well later in the day. And he wasn't able to join his fully sighted friends when they went out for an evening because of it. So he wanted to be with people who were like him in the difficulties they had. And the school and the parents had to fight really hard to get that provision for him. So that's what I wanted to say on that, really.
Could I just come in and say how interesting you say that, Jean? I read a very interesting German paper on exactly that theme, Jean. I could fish out the reference and send it to you about a group of young people, very high achieving, academically achieving, who decided they enjoyed being in an ordinary school, but they wanted to go to a specialist higher gymnasium for similar reasons to what Jean is saying. They didn't regret at all having been in a mainstream school, but they felt that if they have some agency, that's what they wanted. And it's a very in-depth study of how these young people came to make this decision. And I think it's a really to me, it's quite a rare sort of paper. So if you want, I can fish out the reference and circulate it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Chris, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I will just tack on to that one very quick remark, because I see that time is moving on quickly, and it's to say that I think one of the particularly challenging or interesting issues around young people and their views on where next with regard to education provision and the like has to do with national policy too, and entitlements to funding to do certain things. So while some students may at the age of 18 be able to go off to university and so on and so forth, other young people are not presented with such a range of choices. And there are also issues to do with who will pay for what. So these things become kind of quite challenging for anybody working in careers or anyone trying to facilitate transition across phases of education. So it's not just the kind of where somebody wants to go, but the challenges that are then thrown up by what provision is actually available. And in the Welsh context, I'm speaking to people who know all about this, whereas I know nothing. There will be additional challenges, I'm sure, that relate to the demographics and geography in terms of what's available where and how far and if choices are constrained by those matters.
Yes, absolutely. There's a huge amount to consider. Thank you. So if that discussion's coming to an end, can we look to the chat? Is there anybody who would like to add anything, their views or their experience to that particular question around differentiation or inclusion, or maybe even consider, even over your period of time while you've been teaching, have your ideas changed through your experience or what you've read? Is there anything in there, Rhiannon, or are we ready to move on?
No, I don't think. There is some discussion between Christopher and Vicky and Cerys, but I think that's been agreed or resolved.
Yeah.
Resolved in the chat, marvellous. Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks everybody. Thanks, Brahm, for leading on that question. The next question is around learner voice and the challenges of learner voice, which is particularly pertinent to the new code of practice. So the question is, how can you ensure that learner voice is heard when hearing it might be challenging? And that's a question that Jean's going to lead on.
Yeah, I wanted to answer this first in just 2 words, by listening. I think we often hear people, but we don't listen to them. So somebody expresses their view in whatever way they can express it, but we aren't actually listening. We can easily spend too much time talking, or the meeting is too short, and the learner doesn't get the opportunity to express what they want to say, particularly if they find it difficult because of their additional learning need to express themselves. But the other thing I just wanted to add was, I think there's a real lesson to be learnt here from research. When you have to put in for ethics in research, you have to demonstrate how the people who are taking part in your research study have been consulted, and the opportunities they have to withdraw their consent if partway through they become unhappy. And in research studies, if we're working with people with additional learning needs, particularly learning disabilities, one of the things we do is to find out from people who know them well, who they might be comfortable expressing whether they want to take part or not to, whether it's better for them to be asked by somebody they know or the researcher who they don't currently know. And also we find out how they show that they want to continue with the research or don't want to continue with research, if actually they only have very early forms of communication. And so in research, we would ask, good practice in research would be to find out how a young person shows when they're distressed or unhappy. And if we come along to do our piece of research 2 or 3 times in a row, and every time, each of those times, they have to be withdrawn because they show they're unhappy, we take that as them saying, I no longer want to participate. And obviously, I know as well as all of you do, sometimes learners have to do things that they do find uncomfortable or distressing, but we need to be, but listening to them might help us do that in a different way, or to work extremely hard at explaining to them why we really felt that they needed to be, to take a physiotherapy example, they really needed to go in this standing frame for 20 minutes every morning. So that's really my contribution to that. We need to be willing to take time to listen to learner voice. And I'm afraid that means that more resources need to be put in so that people aren't rushing around having to do several IDP meetings in the same morning, which can be the reality, certainly for some large secondary Elencos. So I think that's all I want to say on that one. Where like Chris at the time.
Thanks, Jean. Can we move to Chris next?
I'm just going to say one thing for the sake of time. If we want to ensure the learner voice is heard, as it were, then of course it's really important to recognize that sometimes the learner doesn't want to say anything and doesn't want to be heard. All I wanted to say.
Thank you. Yeah, and Brahm?
I don't want to say too much, but I think there's a dimension that hasn't been dealt with, is where if you have given the time and you have listened to what has been said, there might be a disagreement. And of course, this is where the sort of adult-child power relations come in. And I think this is an issue, and of course, certainly in England, we have mediation systems which haven't worked as well as they might have. And I mean, it can be that you know, it's between parents and the authorities and teachers, rather than between the child or the young person and the adults. But I think some of the challenge is, how do you deal with basic disagreement? Some of that might be to do with resource, not just financial resource, but you know, well-developed supportive provision being available. And I mean, I know, for example, a study I was involved in quite recently of parents whose children had been established at special schools, how they came to choose the special schools. And one of the things that quite a sizable group of those parents said was they were very reluctant to go for a special school placement because they felt that they were in conflict. They would like to have had a more supportive ordinary school provision, but it was just not available. And that's not something they can deal with at an individual level. So some of the challenge is organizational and provision design issues. And I think one has to be realistic about that.
Thank you. Yes, that really opens up the context from all angles, really. And you've all mentioned so far that you're aware of the time, and I guess we are too. And I'm just wondering, out of the questions that we have left, is there one of these that might be we feel is more important to address than the others? I'm aware that both Jean and Brahm have led on questions, and Chris hasn't yet. So perhaps we could start with one of Chris's questions.
Well, I had two to pick up on.
You've got two, yes. Do you want?
But so I mean, I can.
You have a favourite?
You can choose one. One relates to the role of the additional learning needs coordinator, and the other relates to the pandemic and what the question refers to as resilience and a growth mindset. So they're kind of I'm easy.
Okay, how do we choose? Rhiannon as the module lead.
I'm sorry, Rhiannon.
Which do you think? No, I was going to say, which do you think is most? Which question is most appropriate for this particular module?
I think that's called passing the buck, Fliss.
Yeah, it is.
I maybe the ALNCO question, perhaps.
Okay.
It's a bit more generic, and it might be more relevant to more people. I don't know.
That's fine from my perspective, Rhiannon. And I need to confess to colleagues that this is a dull as it may seem, this is a hobby of mine. The role of the special educational needs coordinator in the English context, and I guess in parallel the role of the ALNCO in the Welsh context. So I'll just say a number of things very briefly, and then perhaps Jean and Brahm may wish to add or disagree with the comments I make. So very, very briefly, first of all, my advice for ALNCOs and indeed aspiring ALNCOs is don't try and do it all today or even tomorrow. If you look at what's written in current Welsh guidance, you have the Act, section 60, you have detailed regulations around the role of the SENCO, you have a document on non-statutory guidance on the role of the SENCO, you have a dedicated chapter 8 on the role of the SENCO in the Code of Practice, and you have a Code of Practice that is now pretty encyclopedic. It runs to 371 pages, and almost all of the content in that code is of interest to or relevant to ALNCOs. That's a daunting prospect to my mind. And we can't assume, to my mind, that all ALNCOs are, as the code posits, as it were, senior leaders with fantastic strategic influence. That's kind of written in the code. But you speak to any group of SENCOs or ALNCOs, some of whom I know in Pembrokeshire, for example, it's just not true that SENCOs operate at that level, ALNCOs, SENCOs in England. So I think that the role needs to be thought about from where somebody is, and leadership can begin in a very small way. It doesn't have to be at super strategic level. I also think that vital, and Wales is at a real advantage here, I would argue, when contrasted with the English context, that I think local networks of SENCOs are vitally important to enable them to meet, to be given time to meet. And I don't mean networks, apologies if there are colleagues here who are senior leaders in local authorities. I don't mean networks that are derived from local authority professionals operating as cascade messengers for the Welsh Government, telling people what to do. Those sorts of networks are not so helpful. The networks I'm talking about are those that are ground up, solution focused, where SENCOs, ALNCOs share problems, but share solutions and actually have opportunities to visit each other's settings, so on and so forth. So really learn at a ground level how that which can be changed, what good examples might look like, how somebody in one context has managed to negotiate release time, so on and so forth. The code also, the ALN code, refers to ALNCOs becoming experts in other areas. It's a may. I think that can be very helpful, but I don't believe that it's possible, maybe even desirable, for a SENCO to be an expert in absolutely everything. It's kind of conceptually problematic for a start, but I think it's rather disenfranchising and daunting for people who don't know absolutely everything there is about everything. So I think that's an issue. And I also think the code, the ALN code, isn't strong enough actually in what it says about governing bodies and the role of governors in supporting ALNCOs, particularly when they are fighting a cause that maybe other members of the school leadership team or an FEA leadership team are not quite so committed to. So I think I'll stop there and see if Brahm and Jean want to chip in as well.
I have one thing to say. Listen to Chris about SENCOs. Because he knows about it, because he's involved in the SENCO forum in England. I don't know, it doesn't extend to Wales. Is there a Welsh equivalent, Chris?
No, there isn't. There are Welsh members of the English SENCO forum. I have had discussions with the Welsh government about the benefits of an e-forum for ALNCOs. There may be one that I'm not aware of. It's an e-community, but if you like, again, is meant to be groundswell based and coming from bottom upwards rather than top down.
Thank you, Brahm. Was there anything else you wanted to add apart from recommending?
Well, I mean,
listen to Chris.
I only have one comment. I won't go into detail, but I understand in Portsmouth, in the authority of Portsmouth, they do have some interesting SENCO networks, and they do share and work in schools other than their own and so on. But that's quite an urban area, and therefore transport is probably easier than in the more county rural areas. But I think there's some interesting collaborative work going on which I think sort of embodies what I think Chris is saying.
Yeah.
So if you want to go onto the Portsmouth Local Authority website, and that I'm sure they express that they've got that all.
And the reason I mentioned networks maybe being different in Wales is because Brahm's example is arguably an exception rather than the rule, in the sense that local authorities in the English context are rather old hat. They are struggling to have an influence, whereas in the Welsh context, you have authorities and you have regions. So in a sense, Wales is better placed, I think, to connect its ALNCOs.
Yeah.
Thank you. Jean, would you like to add to that?
No, I don't really think I've got anything to add, just to emphasize Chris's point that you don't have to have all the answers, and it's important to be willing to learn from other people and to make sure that colleagues don't expect you to have all the answers.
Thank you.
Liz, can I just say one thing that I should have said, that you know, that this is an interesting and challenging time for ALNCOs in Wales. Go back to the data I shared earlier on. At the heart of looking at the benefits or otherwise of a reduction in numbers of young people identified are ALNCOs. They are the people who are reviewing their ALN registers. They are the people who are looking anew at who does not have an ALN, who will not need an individual development plan. So this is a really kind of interesting stroke challenging time, I think, for ALNCOs in the Welsh context. So I was really interested to hear what colleagues in the room said about what's happening, and then they're kind of what I read as some quite positive responses to changes, because I had wondered whether some ALNCOs might be struggling just to manage workloads with what's happening in terms of more students requiring an IDP. And it may be the case that all teachers are teachers of children with ALN, but when push comes to shove, who's got the nous to put an IDP in place? You can bet your bottom dollar that it's very frequently falls on the shoulder of the ALN. So just kind of this interest in the positive comments colleagues made earlier about some of those issues.
Yes, thank you. And we just have a few minutes left. So can I pass over to either to the chat? I can't see anything. Oh, there is Lucy. That's an interesting comment. Would you like to expand a little bit more on that, or just say how you feel about that? Lucy's put in the chat that in their special school, they've been told that every teacher is an ALNCO.
Yeah, I don't really understand it, to be honest. It's only because I asked who the ALNCO was in the school that the head teacher said, "Oh, everyone's the ALN. Every teacher is the ALNCO in this school." I don't know if that's a quick statement or that happens in all special schools. I don't know.
When the Act was being written and guidance was being produced, there was a debate about whether, and Jean may be better informed than myself on this, or others in the room maybe, but I know there was a debate, and it happened time and time again, about whether special schools should also have an additional learning needs coordinator. Settlement was, in the end, that there is no requirement in Welsh legislation for school to have an additional learning needs coordinator. The law applies to maintain mainstream schools and further education institutes, and applies in a slightly different way for early years settings, on the assumption, Lucy, that every teacher in a special school is already additionally qualified, so on and so forth. Interestingly, I'm going to hand over to Jean. That isn't necessarily the case. Jean.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think I shall be saved by the bell shortly. It is, of course, not the case that every teacher in a special school is has additional qualifications, and the assumption that teachers can do the work of an Elenco in addition to their own, unless they have more release time to do the work, is very doubtful. But then when there were Senkos or Elencos in special schools, it always seemed a very odd situation. What was their job? When every child in the past had a statement, every child in the special school will have an IDP. So I think it's a difficult one. What we need to say is, if you're going to say that everybody should have additional training in a special school, or you assume that they do, then more professional development opportunities need to be made available to teachers who work in special schools, so that can be true. That's all I've got to say on that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for that input. I'm aware of again of the time, because we do only have quite a short lunch break on this particular day. So can I just say that thank you for people who've put things in the chat, to Vicky, who's just added a few comments there about only mainstream schools needing an Elenco, and the actual upskilling of teachers that she's aware of who are writing IDPs. And to extend a big thank you to Jean and to Brahm and Christopher, who have been our Meet the Experts today, and our first opportunity for as a panel on the course. I hope that's been great for everybody. I can see there are some hands up. Oh, going up and down. Oh, people just agreeing. People saying thank you. Di, you've got your hand up. Did you want to? No, you just
clapping. This.
Great. Okay, that's so much for my eyesight. So a very big thank you again to everybody. That's been really enjoyable and interesting. And again, for me, and I'm sure for, when you get inspired by things that you're hearing, it's one of those I really love my job moments, and I hope everybody who's here has had that feeling as well today. We're going to break now for lunch and return. We're going to have the full half hour, Rhiannon, so it's 1:03 now. Can we allow people back at 1:33 for the next session?
I think so, yeah, 1:33 on the dot.
Yeah, remember to get some fresh air, breathe, eat something healthy, and we'll see you for the next session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you just mute your microphones and turn off your video.